one. We're live. I timed that really, really well. I'm getting really good at not having intro music. I actually did reach out to Cookies on Twitter, who has done some work for us at Paydirt before, to see if he could make an intro video. I'm probably stepping on Tribe's toes a little bit there, but he doesn't want to fucking do actual like editing work anyway. Anyway, my name is James McCool. I'm the owner of PaydirtDFS.com, and this is the NFL DFS Week 14 Slate Talk. We are going to be going over all the really important parts of the Week 14 slate. Talking about high ownership positions, talking about Kamara, talking about cheap running backs, talking about the ways to leverage things correctly and, find yourself a little bit of relative value. If you have not tuned into this podcast before or video podcast, whatever you're watching on stream, this is not usually a pick player A or pick player B stream. This is much more a here's how to put together lineups and roster construction and stuff like that. So, hopefully you learn some cool things here. I am joined this week by Pablo as usual, who is going to maintain his shitty internet for one more week. And then also Squirrel Patrol this week. He is back. He joined us on week 11. I think we had a pretty good week 11 overall, if I remember correctly. And coming back here for week 14. So Squirrel Patrol, how you doing today, man?
Good. Yeah. Had a good Thanksgiving break. But yeah, right back into it. I was just looking up because I know Alvin Kamara is going to be a topic of conversation. He did not do in week 11. He did not do well. So I think I was down on him in week 11, and we'll see what happens this week.
All right. Yeah. Well, hopefully we're on the right side of that one. Pablo, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Apologies preemptively on my last ever stream with bad internet. I am moving after a very long house building process, and everyone will be able to enjoy me in my full HD glory starting next week.
Hey, beautiful. Yeah, I mean HD Pablo is everything that we need in the world. I am doing relatively well. We got to host Thanksgiving, which was great. Cooked turkey, brined it for 3 days, did the whole 9 yards. Hosting went great. Fun fact, my mom had never met Margaret's parents before. We've been together for 10 years, and This was the first year that they met, and it went great. So I'm kind of on cloud 9 there. But we got a little bit of a time limit today. We can't bullshit as much as we usually do, so we're going to kind of jump into things here. As a quick note, really quick, as we look at the models, you'll notice that Zach Charbonnet is projected for 7 fantasy points, but 35% ownership. I have not ran for Kenneth Walker being out yet. The industry had assumed that he was out, but he was not confirmed out until about 30 seconds before John and Pablo jumped onto this show. So didn't have time to run that yet. But as we are thinking about him, he should be projected for somewhere between 12 and 14 fantasy points. So just make the assumption that he is Braylon Allen for the purposes of this show. And as we are talking about that, I think that kind of brings us up on the first major point for this slate is we kind of have these 5 guys, right? These 5 guys are going to absolutely determine everything about the slate. Zach Charbonnet, Alvin Kamara, Isaac Guerrero, Saquon Barkley, and Braylon Allen. Those guys are going to be in, I would guess, 75% of total lineups that are entered into GPPs this week. Maybe a little bit lower if you assume that the field is really bad at this, which they are. So maybe 65 to 70% of all lineups that are in GPPs. I kind of floated the idea towards Squirrel Patrol off camera of, I don't know. I was asked in the Discord over at Paydirt, which is free to join. You should go join it. I was asked if I thought that Charbonnet or Guerrero or Braylon Allen would be the highest owned, like which of those 3 would be higher owned. And I said that I didn't think that any of them would necessarily be the highest owned. I think they'll be owned, but I thought the thing that the field would do would be to ramp up Alvin Kamara ownership since he is now very accessible. So I'm interested in what you guys think here. I guess I'll toss it to Squirrel Patrol first.
Yeah, so I don't know. It's definitely a backup running back slate, right? Like it's evolved now because we've got Braylon Allen, Charbonnet, and Guerrero. So I'm down on Alvin Kamara. I'll just say, like, I'm kind of down on him. I think I don't think he should be projected higher than Saquon Barkley. The Philadelphia offense is obviously much better. So like I would do, try to find the extra money and try to get to Saquon Barkley. I just every week I just flip like Saquon Barkley and Alvin Kamara's projections because I think Barkley should be projected higher. And I think especially for this game against the Giants, like the Giants, might be folding it in and going home. I think Kamara's projection is based, like everywhere on him getting a bunch of receptions because like they don't have anyone else to pass the ball to. I don't think they necessarily need to pass the ball in this game. Like, this is not a game where the Saints will necessarily be playing from behind or worried about the Giants like putting up 40 points. So I think Saquon Barkley should be projected higher than Alvin Kamara. I really like the backup running backs, and I might actually play like all three of these guys in some lineups and try to spend up at receiver, which is something that I don't think anybody else is going to do.
Yeah, I think that paying up at wide receiver, I really like the idea of paying down at both running backs here because I think that you can. And whenever you can have the opportunity to do that, I think you should. That being said, as much as being on the lower end of running back pricing, paying up at wide receiver, I also think that very few people will pay for Alvin Kamara and Saquon Barkley and pay down at wide receiver. So I actually think you have both of those extremes available to you. Pablo, how do you feel about this situation?
Yeah, I feel fairly similar to what John thinks. I mean, I feel like we've had Alvin Kamara in this situation so many times this year, and usually he does fine. I feel like very infrequently does he fully bury you. And so my inclination is to be under the field on him. And I think there's a bigger debate around what to do on the cheap side. I don't have much of a debate about Saquon versus Alvin Kamara. I'm fully in agreement with Squirrel there. I think that Saquon in this spot, it's like kind of the nut matchup. He's unbelievable. I don't find it that difficult to get up to him. There's plenty of value either in your primary quarterback plus stacks partners or even just in other ways of getting value. So I personally love Saquon. The only thing I'll say about Saquon, I think there's two components to this question. One is, if you're going to pick, who do you pick? I strongly lean Saquon. I will say, I feel like every sharp is going to feel that way. And I would be extremely unsurprised to flip the cards over and find that Saquon's ownership in the sharper contest is higher than is projected. Because I think everybody is sort of being like, wait, if I can get up to Saquon, why am I not playing him instead of Kamara? So I just think we should be aware of that. Just don't assume he's going to be as low as we think he will be. And then I think the second component is, how do you feel about the cheap running backs? Because there's still a decision to be made there in terms of who you play amongst them, right? And we can talk about that. But I think they're in very different situations. I think Charbonnet versus Garendo versus Braylon Allen are each very different situations from one another. And I think they each are while they project similarly, I think there's different levels of confidence we can have in that projection based on where those teams are and based on the role we expect those players to have in that game environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I look at those cheap running backs, and to your point, I do think that Saquon Barkley is probably going to be. I think Barkley and Kamara are both going to get an extra 5% ownership on top of what I have projected here. Like I think Kamara will probably be somewhere between 30 and 35%. I think Saquon Barkley will probably be between 25 and 30%. I do think that Barkley will come in lower than Kamara, but not by much. But to your point, I have Fantasy Life's DVP tool up here, which I built the logic for, and you can get over that. It's way too cheap to go subscribe over at Fantasy Life too. So the Panthers are a walking 100-yard boost for running backs. I mean, they are allowing two opponents 27.6 fantasy points per game, PPR points per game, a boost of 8.8 fantasy points above average to opposing running backs, 127 yards, 54 yards above average to opposing running backs. Like it is the absolute nuts matchup. Now, the only question that you have to ask yourself here, I think, is which running back is going to get that boost? Because there are technically three running backs on Philadelphia. There is Saquon Barkley, and then there's Kenneth Gainwell, and then there's Jalen Hurts. And it is worth saying that this boost, like, there's a reason why these boosts to half PPR and standard are higher than the rest of the league. It's because of the touchdowns. It's because they allow a lot of rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs. So Saquon Barkley does like all of his damage from outside of the red zone. Once they get into the red zone, it is kind of a toss-up a little bit between him and Jalen Hurts. And what I said last week when we were talking about the Bucky Irving situation with Scott Barrett was that I wasn't sold on Bucky Irving, mostly because I thought that the running backs for Tampa Bay were going to score 35 fantasy points. I had no question in that. Like, running backs just score a shit ton of points against Carolina. My issue is I don't know where it's going to be distributed. And I kind of feel the same way about Barkley. Like, there's a way here that we love Barkley and that he's a terrific play. And then Jalen Hurts has 2 rushing touchdowns and throws for 2 touchdowns to A.J. Brown, who's an absolute fucking monster and is going to be like 6% owned or something, because people aren't going to want to stack Philadelphia against Carolina, who has been a sieve in every conceivable manner. So I do think that there is something to be said about the Philadelphia stacks. And when we look at wide receivers overall, like, I have A.J. Brown as the highest overall median, and he's projected for 7% ownership. So I think that there is a worthwhile question of asking from a 1v1 perspective and considering ownership, would you rather have Saquon Barkley at 25 to 30%, or would you rather have A.J. Brown at 5 to 10%?
Yeah, and I think I don't want to get too off the beaten path, but I do think a lot of this comes down to what do you prioritize in your lineup this week? Do you prioritize a cheap stack with a pay down quarterback that allows you to get up to the A.J. Brown or Saquon, or do you pay up at quarterback with an expensive pairing partner? And you can still play some of the pay up players, but you're going to be a little more balanced than if you go cheap at quarterback. I'm not saying that they're inextricably sort of linked, but to some degree, kind of what we're deciding on what you do at running back or receiver is strongly dictated by what you decide to do with your quarterback receiver pairings this week, because there's a big difference in using Sam Darnold with J. Jeff than there is in using a Will Levis with Akine Westbrook or Calvin Ridley. I mean, and I think the cheaper quarterback route, and by the way, you can even still go the cheaper quarterback route and pivot. Well, we can talk about that, but there's other cheap quarterback pairings that'll be a lot less owned than Will Levis that projects similarly if you still want that roster construct without a chalky Levis stack. And I'm not trying to distract ourselves from the A.J. Brown Saquon discussion, but I just think it's important to keep in mind that I think all of us are going to be debating, are you paying down a quarterback, or are you using a more expensive pairing with your receiver quarterback?
How about you? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the floor for A.J. Brown is so low. You've got Devontae Smith back. And I have a whole narrative thing that I think Saquon's, starting to get some MVP talk, and the perception with the Eagles is he's been very selfless. He's not like going out there complaining about not getting touchdowns when they do the push into the end zone. So like maybe, and this is a game that Philadelphia should absolutely dominate the Panthers. So if they're up like 35-10 going into the, in the fourth quarter or something, and and A.J. Brown runs out at the 1 yard line, like maybe they actually hand the ball off to Saquon Barkley rather than try to get Jalen Hurts the touchdown. But I think Hurts is a good play. I think A.J. Brown is a good play. I think Saquon's a good play. I mean, this team's implied to score, I think, like 29, the most points on the slate. And we kind of saw with Detroit when they just demolished Jacksonville. Like sometimes we look at these blowouts, like, oh, I don't want to play the guys from this team because they're expensive and they might not play the fourth quarter kind of thing. And so, they could put up 40 something points. So I don't think there's a wrong answer. But I think amongst the options, I think my favorite is probably Saquon. Like, there's only a $900 difference between Saquon Barkley and AJ Brown, but there's like a huge gap in projection.
Yeah, there's a 6-point gap in median projection. Certainly recognize that from a median perspective, it's harder to justify somebody like AJ Brown. I do think that as I look at the slate, like Pablo, to your point about the cheap quarterbacks, I think that the cheap quarterbacks are a conversation. I think the thing that's way more important is trying to figure out that mix of running backs. Because we do have those 3 cheap running backs, and you could feasibly use all 3 of them and have an average cost of your running backs and flex be $5,100 with a median expectation of like 45 fantasy points. And if you do that, the quarterback cost doesn't matter. The wide receiver cost doesn't matter. The tight end cost doesn't matter. I mean, you literally have 3 running backs who should have somewhere around a 70 to 75% share of the work for their teams. And Zach Charbonnet has produced really well in that role before. The one question mark I think on it, because I kind of look at Charbonnet and Guerrero as the exact same play, but the question mark on it really is Braylon Allen. Mm-hmm. People were kind of high on Braylon Allen coming in as a rookie, but he has sucked dick this year, to be fair. In terms of his base stats, he's been really bad. So I think that there will be plenty.
That's how you really feel.
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be talk about it, and I think that it's worth, like, when you have these 3 cheap running backs, you gotta have something to designate them away from each other.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of the thing that's going to make a lot more sense is, like, when you're looking at the slate, are you trying to pair Saquon Barkley with Guerrero, or are you trying to pair Saquon Barkley with Kamara, or are you trying to pair Zach Charbonnet with Guerrero? And those are the 3 main paths I think that you're going to have when you're building out rosters this week. And frankly, I love that because this slate is so wide open from a roster construction path. You can build however you want. You can have an expensive stack. You can have a cheap stack. You can have expensive tight ends. You can have a double TE. Like, you can do whatever you want because there's so much flexibility at running back. So
hold on. So let's stick at running back for a second, because I think I have a feeling you both agree based on the way you described it. But I want to see if we agree or not, or we don't. Guerrero, I think we feel like we're probably extrapolating based off of the Jordan Mason role earlier this year, right? And I think we feel comfortable doing that. Whether we should feel comfortable doing that or not, I defer to you both, who study rosters more than I do. But that's my inclination is like, okay, this is Jordan Mason again with CMC out. And it's the question is that a fair, apples to apples analogy or not? Like, can we say Guerrero is Jordan Mason at his price? I'm not saying that they're the same player. I'm saying they're in the same role and we can expect the same usage. Charbonnet, to your point, James, I think has been in this spot before. I didn't go back and look, but my recollection is similar to yours, which is he did fine. He didn't go crazy, but he's so cheap, and it seems like a good game environment that I don't have much anxiety about him. Although I don't know that I feel as great about him as I do about Guerrero on a Niners team that I feel like likes to really run the ball as a fair amount. And then Braylon Allen, I have major concerns about. I feel like I just feel like the Jets are done. Like the Jets are like, they're out of the playoffs. They put Sauce Gardner and Breece Hall on IR. Like, Miami, while slim, is trying to do everything they can to win out, so they give themselves a chance to get the final wildcard spot. I just really, I feel very. I can't think of a good reason outside of ownership that I would play Braylon Allen over Charbonnet or Guerrero. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because James, to your point at the beginning, those 3 guys combined with Kamara and Barkley are so critical in terms of how much ownership they're going to command, that I think it's kind of important to decide how you feel about each of them and who you're going to prioritize.
Before I pass it to you, Squirrel Patrol, really quick, I just wanted to say, when we're looking at rushing props, Guerrero right now has a prop of 15.5 rushing attempts, and Braylon Allen is at 13.5. Like, we should expect really good volume for Guerrero. At 15.5, he's really just below Tony Pollard, Chase Brown, Alvin Kamara at 18.5, and Saquon Barkley at 20.5. That's a good volume expectation. So, I think that we should probably expect when Kenneth Walker is actually declared, well, he's been declared out, but once props load in for him, once prop market has caught up, I would expect us to see Charbonnet's rushing prop be something like 14.5 or 15.5, maybe even a little bit higher because of the workload they got earlier in the year. So I really expect all three of those guys to basically be the same. So go ahead, Squirrel.
I might think a little bit differently, and I might have some biases. Last time we saw Zach Charbonnet in this role, he won me $200,000 on FanDuel. So I have a strong preference for Charbonnet.
Mic drop.
Yeah. But I do think he's the best of the bunch. I think it's a somewhat clear difference over Garendo. Charbonnet, we've seen him in this role before. He's the pass catching back, even when he's not in this role, or at least he catches passes, and we know we've seen him go out and catch a bunch of passes. And I think he's the cheapest. I think he's a few $100s cheaper. So that, that's not nothing, even though we're starting to get a bunch of savings on the slate. I think it's definitely Charbonnet first. I think it's Garendo second. That role is it just has a reputation of they just stick anybody in there, and they just use that guy. So there's something to be said for that. I think he was a converted receiver in college. So he should catch. He should at least have the ability to catch passes. But do they trust him in pass protection? We don't know. I will say I think Trent Williams is out. Is that? Mm-hmm. That could make a big difference. The 49ers offense, I feel like every time Trent Williams is out, just flutter. Just can't get anything moving. So that's something to consider. And then Pablo, I think you might be biased because they're playing the Dolphins this week.
Very possible.
Yeah, but I hate the Jets too. I think they've been garbage all year. So and there's nothing, putting Braylon Allen instead of Breece Hall in, is not going to change that. So I think that's my clear pecking order.
Yeah, to be clear, Zach Charbonnet, when he had this role in weeks 2 and 3, 90% of the snaps, 78% of the rushing attempts, 12% of the targets, 14% targets per route run, 95% of the long down and distance, 92% of the short down and distance, and 21.8 PPR points per game. That's a fucking good role. I mean, that is arguably Chase Brown for 4,800. And we had the Chase Brown conversation last week, and his role is terrific. So I think that pecking order is right. I think the other thing that we need to talk about when we talk about San Francisco, and this is actually a pretty good leeway on the Trent Williams point. We'll break kind of into wide receivers here a little bit. Juwan Jennings is projected to also be one of the highest owned players on the slate. At 5,200, he's projecting for 26% ownership right now in regular fields, 39% in small field. Really considerable ownership. Him and Jacoby Myers are basically the same play, I would think. But there is something to be said about Juwan Jennings. So San Francisco, something that Brock Purdy had said in an interview when they didn't have Christian McCaffrey is that he felt not having Christian McCaffrey available had made it so he had to push down the field more. And I went and I looked at the data, and Juwan Jennings, when Christian McCaffrey does play, has an ADOT of around 7 to 8 yards, 7.5 yards. When Christian McCaffrey does not play, Juwan Jennings has an ADOT of 12 to 14, and he maintains that target share. So we're talking about a guy who has a 26 to 30% target share and an ADOT of 12 to 14. That's Devontae Smith. That's a good deep threat wide receiver. And at 5,200 against Chicago, and now Chicago I don't think is the worst team in the world, but we did see them just get brutalized by Detroit, and Detroit was able to move the ball at will. I find it hard to get away from Juwan Jennings if I do not have Isaac Garendo. And I think that there's also instances where you can do Garendo plus Juwan Jennings. Now, I don't think that I would include Garendo in a stack, but I guess what I'm trying to get at here is we have these three running backs of Braylon Allen, Zach Charbonnet, and Isaac Garendo. And if you don't have Garendo, I don't know how you don't just lock in Juwan Jennings as a pivot off that, it's basically the same price. How do you guys feel about Juwan Jennings? Squirrel, do you want to go first on that?
Sure. I think, he definitely stands out, with Jacoby Myers as like kind of mispriced or, definitely a good value, point per dollar. I prefer my running backs point per dollar over my wide receivers just because like the floor for like all wide receivers can be, for most wide receivers, can be pretty low. Chicago doesn't have a terrible defense. I think actually have a pretty good defense. So it's not like a matchup I definitely want to target. I don't know. The Trent Williams thing does like kind of stick in my head. What if Brock Purdy is just not that good if they don't have Trent Williams there, protecting him? And then, and so then like, what if like San Francisco just overall disappoints as a defense? Like, I don't think you necessarily need to have like Garendo or Jennings. I think you can also just play for for the possibility that San Francisco just disappoints on offense.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think they're favored at home. So I don't think it's necessarily like a big stand I'm taking that San Francisco is going to flounder. But I don't know. Jennings is really good for the price. I probably prefer Jacoby Myers, but it's pretty close.
Yeah. Pablo, how do you feel about San Francisco and Juwan Jennings?
I feel fairly similarly. I mean, I think just the usage on the cheap running backs feels a lot more stout. Like it feels a lot less fragile. Like I think we've seen a lot of slates where wide receiver variance is where we kind of separate ourselves from the field. Like we've all been saying that like all year we've been sort of saying like at running back, like just maybe don't get that crazy because just don't mess it up kind of. And then wide receiver is kind of where you get your leverage in tight end. I have a hard time separating my wide receivers this week from my stacking quarterback. Like oftentimes, like we'll have a week where we've had some weeks where Nico Collins or CeeDee Lamb have been like truly prioritization pay up wide receivers. I don't feel that way this week. Like this week, I feel more about who am I going to use at quarterback, and then I feel like that's going to dictate a lot of my wide receiver builds. I think Jennings and Myers, for that matter, are both really strong plays. And I don't think there's anything wrong, even if you have enough leverage, as using them as one-offs. Certainly amongst the best, if not the best, point per dollar plays on the slate. But I also feel very comfortable sort of letting my quarterback decision drive my wide receiver decisions rather than the other way around.
Yeah, to that point, when you're on the contest ends right now, and you take a look at quarterback exposures, Sam Darnold and Will Levis are very popular in the contest sims here. Will Levis ends up in 30% of winning lineups, Darnold in 32% of winning lineups. Pretty heavy exposure rates there for two quarterbacks. I'm really interested by the Sam Darnold thing because he's going to be like nothing owned. And I thought that we were going to see more Brock Purdy based on the way that the models shook out, but nope. It's Sam Darnold over him. So Will Levis, I think, is the one that you're kind of alluding to when you're saying cheap quarterbacks. And I think there are a lot of people on him. His projected ownership is around 11%. I think he probably comes in that range, 10 to 15%. And then in the contest sims, he is paired a lot with Calvin Ridley at 5,700, who at 14% projected ownership does actually make sense as a pivot away from Juwan Jennings at 5,200, since they are close enough there in price. But I think that what a lot of people are going to do here is go Will Levis, Calvin Ridley with Juwan Jennings, and then, maybe one other mid-price wide receiver, go with a cheap running back and an expensive running back, and then, whatever the fuck at tight end. I think there's going to be a lot of mid-range wide receivers. And I just keep getting back to this point that when we go and we look at the range of outcomes for wide receivers, we get no ownership on A.J. Brown. We get very little ownership on Cooper Kupp. Like, we sort this by expensive wide receivers. 15% on Justin Jefferson. I think it's going to be a little bit lower than that. Tyreek Hill at 5%. This is the week that he fucking blows up, by the way. This is absolutely the week that, like, since everybody is off of him, he's going to nuke the Jets. Cooper Kupp at 7, Malik Neighbors at 1, George Pickens at 6. George Pickens has been terrific. for like 6 weeks straight. He's been really, really good. Devontae Adams at 4, Garrett Wilson at 1. Like, we have all these guys who are really, really low owned in these upper ranges, these alpha wide receivers. And to your point, Pablo, the way to win at DFS this year has be different at wide receiver. So I keep going back to the idea of, okay, I certainly understand why Alvin Kamara and Saquon Barkley are projected to be 30% owned, and I think they will both be 30% owned. But like, man, I really like AJ Brown, and I really like Justin Jefferson, and I even want some Tyreek Hill. Like, we talked a lot about the Miami offense being super condensed, and it still is. And against the Jets, who the Jets got absolutely shredded by Anthony fucking Richardson. We don't think that Tua can do that with Tyreek Hill and Jonnu Smith. So I really like paying up at wide receiver this week. And I just think when we have cheap running backs, that should just be the way that you build.
Yeah, actually, I Justin Jefferson might be my favorite play on the slate. Because, like, why are we seeing so much Sam Darnold ownership and not, nobody wants to play Justin Jefferson. He hasn't scored a touchdown in a while, but that's there's just touchdown variance. I think he hit 99 yards last game. Like, it's one more reception for 100, right? It's like 4 more points. He's putting up over 20 points. He's 7,800. Like, we were paying 8,800 last month. Yeah. So I don't know. I think Atlanta gives up the 5th most receptions per game. Like, it's a defense you beat by passing. Minnesota, on the other side, has a really good defense, but I think they give up the 2nd most receptions per game. So yeah, these teams give up the 2nd and 5th most receptions per game. Like, it's not necessarily going to be a blowout. Minnesota's defense is good, but it could be. I don't know. Or not necessarily going to be like a shootout. Yeah, but it could be. So yeah, I want to have Justin Jefferson. Like, it seems like people are just like kind of forgotten about him. The team's doing well. He's still out there performing. He just hasn't put up the monster game yet. But it could be this week, and then he's gonna be like less than 20% owned. And now we've got all these savings. So yeah, I like spending up for Justin Jefferson. I think if you're not playing Saquon Barkley, you can make an argument for AJ Brown. I think with all of this, like, I want to play multiple cheap running backs and pay up at wide receiver. Like, you can play 2 cheap running backs, Saquon Barkley or Alvin Kamara, and Justin Jefferson. Like, what? I don't know. Yeah, I'm gonna probably do something like that.
Yeah, one of the things
before you take over, I wanted to say that game environment, the Vikings give up the largest fantasy boost above average to wide receivers. The Falcons give up the 5th largest fantasy boost to wide receivers. Pablo, how much do you love taking Kirk Cousins in this spot?
I don't know that we need him. Like, I prefer just to take Darnold. Like Squirrel said, like, I love J-Jeff. And if Darnold, I think Darnold will be like one of the top 3 owned quarterbacks, but that'll be because the slate is so wide open, that'll be like 10 to 15%. So that doesn't make me feel that worried, especially for smaller field. Like, oh my God, I'm going to have a 10% Darnold with J-Jeff, right? What I'm asking myself as I'm thinking through builds is, it's kind of like this median versus ceiling debate, right? Like Levis stacks obviously afford you a tremendous amount of money, especially if you use 1 or 2 of the cheap running backs. You can basically just do whatever the hell you want after that. I mean, but what I always have to remind myself on these types of slates is we're looking for ceiling. Like, we're looking for ceiling. And I don't, the question is, macroscopically, are you okay doing sort of a chalkier stack and then pivoting at some of the flex spots? Or would you rather pivot at your stack and then not have to worry that much about eating, some chalk running back and getting different at receiver? And I kind of keep going back to, I think I'd rather get a little different at quarterback and receiver. And there's like multiple options. I mean, there's so many options to stack this week that are not going to be owned that it's hard for me not to feel good about that approach. Like Tua, Baker Mayfield, your boy Russell Wilson. Like, Caleb Williams, if you still want to go cheap and you think that they can do okay against the Niners. All of those are going to have very little ownership and allow you to still eat some chalk at running back and get up to J. Jeff and AJ Brown or whatever. I don't particularly like Kirk Cousins, but I agree it's a good game environment. I just feel like it's a little cute. Like I'd rather just play Darnold with J. Jeff and maybe Hawkinson. I always like pairing my tight end with my quarterback for reasons we've talked about before. It's like playing your catcher and your baseball stack. Anyway, those are my high level thoughts. The biggest debate I've been having sort of macro build wise is, do I get different at my quarterback stack and then allow myself to eat some more chalk in my running back spots? Or do I do the Levis thing, but then have to get kind of weird with my other spots? And I don't know. What do you guys think about sort of that construct question I'm asking myself?
I'll go to you first, Squirrel, on that. I mean, I like Sam Darnold. I don't like Will Levis as much. It's like I kind of was looking at, well, they're playing Jacksonville. Will Levis could be like a sneaky cheap play. And no, like, yeah, he's not gonna be sneaky. And the game's got a 40-point total. They could just run Tony Pollard. I think Sam Darnold is much safer, like a 6-point favorite at home in a game with a 45.5-point total. Against a defense that's like better against the run than the pass. Like I'd much rather go to Sam Darnold. I just would add Justin Jefferson to that like Sam Darnold stack. And then so I guess, and I kind of agree, like just philosophically, I'd much rather play the chalky running backs, get different quarterback and receiver than try to avoid the chalky running backs for a perceived ownership or something, and then try to play like the chalkier wide receivers.
So here's kind of the way that I'm looking at, because I think that Minnesota Atlanta is my favorite game environment. Probably by a good amount. The way that I have always approached Tyreek Hill, and kind of the way that I approach Justin Jefferson as well, is if I want exposure to them, I'm much less likely to stack them with Tua, and I'm much more like with Tua and with Sam Darnold, and I'm much more likely to stack the other team. Mostly because if I'm paying for Tyreek Hill, the expectation is that he nukes and takes nearly all the fantasy relevancy for the team. Same thing with Justin Jefferson. If I'm playing Justin Jefferson, I'm playing him because I want 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, not because I want 100 yards and 1 touchdown. So in that light, if I stack them with the quarterback, like I'm not wanting the quarterback plus Waddle or Addison. And I recognize that like Waddle and Addison can still get there and Tyreek Hill can get there. But in the games where Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson goes absolutely crazy, typically it's not with another person on their team that also goes nuts. Usually we don't see them in part of a full game stack do super duper well, and they pull the game stack across the line by themselves. So usually what I do is I stack the other side. That's kind of what I was asking about Kirk Cousins. And I think that this game environment is kind of the perfect spot to do that. Like, one, Sam Darnold's going to be the most popular quarterback on the slate. He's going to be 15 to 20% owned. So I'm not a super big fan of taking the highest owned quarterback, especially with the range of outcomes for quarterbacks being so skinny. Two, I think that a lot of the reason why people want to use Sam Darnold is because they think this game environment is really good and they can pair him with Justin Jefferson. And three, I think that nobody is really putting as much emphasis on the Atlanta side of things. Like, we're going to see ownership, but not significant ownership on those pieces. Actually, maybe we're not. Like, so Drake London at 17% owned, but he's not even the one I'm super interested in. I'm interested in Darnell Mooney, who is way down here at 4% owned. So I think that, especially considering Minnesota is the best pass defense in the league to attack for wide receivers. I like the idea of using Justin Jefferson, but not as much using Sam Darnold. It just occurs to me that using Kirk Cousins plus Drake London plus Darnell Mooney and bring it back to Justin Jefferson feels like a much better way to attack things in GPPs. It gives me more relative value while allowing me to utilize that game environment, and I can use super chalky running backs with it because I already have low ownership from Kirk Cousins and Darnell Mooney. So that's kind of why I asked about the Kirk Cousins spot, because I think that he's probably, from the way that I approach GPPs, the perfect spot for me to be at quarterback.
I think he's okay. I just worry that like they're 6-point underdogs on the road going against a pretty good defense. So I think like Minnesota is much more likely to put up points. I put up a lot of points than Atlanta. I'll be playing some Kirk Cousins. Like I don't think he's like a bad play. I just prefer Darnold. We never see like quarterbacks get like that high ownership, and I do think also that with all this value that's opening up, I think we're going to get some more, some more people paying up for the expensive quarterbacks. I don't know. Actually, like I don't want to like totally pivot things, but we should actually put some thought into like playing more Bills, Rams, because that's a game that is like maybe too expensive, but I think it's like one of the higher total games on the slate, and now we suddenly have a bunch of value. So it's just a thought that occurred to me.
Yeah, Buffalo has a 27.25 implied team total. Second highest on the slate behind Philadelphia. So yeah, to your point, that's a really high team total. Miami team total 26.5. I'm telling you, Tyreek Hill is going to fucking crush this week, and we're all going to be bummed about it. And then Minnesota at 25.75 and Pittsburgh at 25. So I usually focus on teams that have a team total above 25. So those guys, and then Tampa Bay. Nobody talking about Tampa Bay, really. Nobody at all talking about Tampa Bay. And Mike Evans, 28 fantasy points, looked like Mike Evans last week. This is who are they up against here?
Vegas, and you got your boy Bowers as a bring back too. If you want to play Myers,
look at that game environment. You can go Baker Mayfield plus Mike Evans plus K-Dot and bring it back with Bowers and Myers and hope the game goes to the moon, 55, 60 real life points, and you get all of it. Like that's a condensed game environment right there.
And by the way, if you still want to go dumpster diving at quarterback, I think you could do worse than AOC plus Myers and Bowers.
Yeah,
I'm not going to do it because I don't play large field enough to justify that. But like to me, that's much more exciting than playing a chalky Will Levis. So to your point earlier, James, I think this slate is really wide open for two reasons. Number one, we have several good game environments. Number two, pricing is loose enough where you can kind of like build around many different priorities. And so, yeah, I mean, the other point I want to make is, so number one, I feel very good about rotating different stacks. We just mentioned several of them that I think will be totally under the radar. Baker stacks, AOC, and if you want to get different and fade Garendo, you could even do Purdy. I share Squirrel's concerns about that game. I'm kind of a little worried that the Niners may just not get there. But, they certainly sim really well, and they look really good on the pay dirt sheets. So I think it's worth mentioning that Purdy stacks are worthy of consideration. Mm-hmm. To your other point, James, and I actually wrote a question to myself when I was kind of looking at the slate this morning to ask both of you, is I mostly agree with you on kind of how to think about pairing partners for quarterbacks, and who's going to eat the majority of the fantasy production, to the point you made around JJF and Tyreek Hill. I do think it's important to consider pricing as part of that debate, right? Because Tyreek Hill at 7,100 is a very different play than JJF at his price. And I think it's not impossible for Tyreek and Jonnu to get there just because of the price. Even if Tyreek eats most of the production. I also think you can play two with Achane, who will be unowned because everyone's going to play Barkley and Kamara. I think Achane is like a really, really strong pivot this week. Really strong pivot. And you can pair him with Tua and Jonnu for that matter, if you want to get different, and then eat chalk around at the rest of it. But yeah, I kind of like the ability this week to play, quarterbacks who won't be as owned, in really nice game environments like Baker, John. I mean, that's a really great point on the Rams Bills game. Like that game is going to be. We've had a few games like this where we had the Ravens Eagles game was like this. I think last week or the week before, where everybody was priced at a price point that was kind of uncomfortable to build outside of one-offs. And sometimes especially in a week like this where we have so much value, if you focus on like the unowned higher total game and stack it up a little bit, you're going to get a lot of leverage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I think there was like another Ravens game, like Ravens Bengals, like early in the season. It was like that. Whereas like it was too expensive. Like Jamar Chase, like looked like a good play. It was just, you don't want to pay up for him. Derrick Henry's expensive. Lamar Jackson, and then like Jamar Chase just went berserk. I didn't get over 50 points.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it was like one of these weeks where like, we just didn't have the value, but it didn't matter. Just like pick anybody and put them in with Jamar Chase and his 50 fantasy points. So I don't know if this game has that kind of environment, but I mean, it's still a pretty good game environment at a pretty low ownership.
One of the great things about this week, by the way, and we've lamented this like the last 3 weeks, and I'm really happy about that this week that we don't have to do it. We don't have to play any shitty $3,500 receivers this week.
Yeah.
Because we have all the running back value and mid-range receivers and Jacoby Myers and Juwan Jennings. Like you don't have to play this fragile, shitty ass wide receiver chalk, right? And it's kind of really nice not to have to do that. Like you can play good players and just get different with your lineup.
I still really like Calvin Austin.
Dude, you don't need to convince me on Russell Wilson. I was like, the first thing I did this morning when I kind of went through minutes analysis was I went on pay dirt and I was like, man, I really kind of hope Russell Wilson projects well because James has always been a Russell Wilson, Jesus Christ, can't say that. Russell Wilson truther. And I was sort of disappointed that his stack range of outcomes, James, you go to stacks, doesn't look that great. And part of that's probably because Najee looks really strong. Yeah, he's kind of far down there, but I just think to your point, James, like, dude, Pickens has just been balling. So like if you can play Russ with Pickens and either Austin or Freiermuth, that's going to be like very low in stacks, but I was a little disappointed that it doesn't look to project that well.
Yeah, I mean, Pickens across the course of the year averaging 13, but since week 7, Pickens has been great, averaging 16 fantasy points per game, good utilization score, solid TPRR and targets per route run, stuff like that. He's been really, really good. I wanted to point out one more thing really quick before we do final thoughts here, but I did the overall range of outcomes for tight ends, wide receivers. I just wanted to plug what I consider to be my entire identity this year. The expensive tight ends are still $1,000 too cheap, at the very least, if not $1,500 too cheap. Brock Bowers is the wide receiver 3 in median projection. Trey McBride is the wide receiver 4 in median projection. He is $6,100. He is $500 more than Jacoby Myers, who is going to be really, really popular and projects for 1.15 points better. So I say again, I think that tight end in the flex, if you are playing Bowers or McBride, is a terrific idea. They are wide receivers. They should be considered wide receivers. They are too cheap if you consider them as wide receivers, especially because both of those guys, if you like the Tampa Bay spot, you can play Brock Bowers in the flex with K. Dotton. And if you like using Zach Charbonnet, then you can use Trey McBride as a game stack correlation piece at 6,100 in the flex. And it's totally fine. So I just wanted to do that as well. Just point that out. Tight ends have been something that have been, a really, really interesting piece this year. And I just think that people are playing kind of them wrong. And last point on tight ends before we go to closing thoughts. Jonnu Smith is probably $1,500 to $2,000 too cheap still. $5,300, he projects for 7% ownership. I know I've been talking about Miami a lot, but I think the Jets just are fucking atrocious, and they are just tanking their season at this point. So this is a get-right spot for Miami, I think. And, Jonnu and Tyreek Hill. And Achane, who, to your point, Pablo, is going to be like 7% owned at 8,200. Like, nobody's going to play him over Kamara. So I think that Miami has a bunch of pieces that you should consider. And that's all that I'm going to give on those thoughts. So let's move to some closing thoughts here. Pablo, do you want to go first on closing thoughts here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this might sound like an obvious point, but I still don't think it's made enough, which is I somewhat routinely have to remind myself of the game we're playing, right? And the game we are playing is not to predict the future. The game we are playing is try to beat the field. And so when you're making your decisions, I think you're even really good players fall into this trap of saying, what is my best median where I don't compromise ceiling, instead of saying, what is the best median and or ceiling where I pass the majority of the field. And so when I'm building this week on a week where we have so much flexibility in roster construction, and where I feel that you can change the common build, whether that's building around a cheap Levis stack or whether that's building around the running backs that everybody's using. I'm going to purposely keep in mind ceiling and leverage, because it's really easy to forget that your goal is not to just score the most points. It's to score the most points in a way that separates you from the field. And I just want to hammer that home because I don't hear it enough as part of DFS analysis.
Squirrel Patrol, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm going to lean in to the mispriced running backs. And, in terms of multi-entry, I think it's a thing. I'm just going to be over the field, kind of, virtually locking in some of the cheap running backs and just alternating stacks. And just hope to hit a good game environment. I think that these backup running backs, although they can hit really high ownership, like sometimes they're not owned enough. And now we have like multiple of them. So I'll probably rotate through them. And just in terms of game environment, I think I like Minnesota, Atlanta the best. I want to be over the field with Justin Jefferson. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I am gonna combine those two things together. I think that both the cheap running backs are going to be underowned, and I also think that the stacks that belong to the teams here are also going to be underowned. I think that Zach Charbonnet, if you don't play Zach Charbonnet, you should very seriously consider using a Seattle stack. If he's going to be 35% owned and DK Metcalf puts up 30 fantasy points and Geno Smith puts up 26 fantasy points, highest scoring quarterback, you're going to pass large swaths of the field by having a Seattle stack. Same thing with Isaac Orendo. If Isaac Orendo is going to be 25% owned and, you have Purdy plus Juwan Jennings plus George Kittle, if San Francisco puts up 35 real life points through the passing game and that game is competitive, like you're going to pass a considerable amount of the field by not having Orendo. So, on the thoughts of utilizing cheap running backs while also trying to pass the field, I think that you should always kind of be looking for ways to say, how can I pass the field by playing optimally? Because with that Zach Charbonnet situation, right? If you fade Zach Charbonnet and play Seattle stack, you can literally optimize on ownership for the rest and be fine. And just enter that in whatever contest you want. Because you have so much relative value by stacking Seattle that you want to lower your volatility by then also having Kamara and Orendo and Juwan Jennings and like all of this other ownership around it. So this is a really, really cool week because I think you can pass large portions of the field by playing in a way that has optimal build paths by just taking advantage of different pieces of chalk that people are just overconfident in. Tony Pollard on that same note, like if 15% of the field wants to stack Will Levis against Jacksonville, I really like Tony Pollard at like 6,400, especially because he's in no man's land in terms of price with people wanting to do stars and scrubs with their running back pairing. So be thinking about things that way. I think that it's really, really valuable to do so, especially as a single entry and 3 max player. So yeah, that's going to do it for us. Like I said, usually we would bullshit for a little while longer, but both of these guys have important things to do that are not just talking about fantasy sports. I know that seems hard to believe, but thank you guys so much for tuning in. This has been put on by Pater. If you have not gone and tried all of the tools and content and stuff like that over at paterdfs.com, you absolutely should. Over on the YouTube, I did a breakdown video with Eric Haber, Sheets Pone. And he went through the site as kind of like a more novice player or as more novice to the site as a sharp player. And he found a lot of things that he didn't even know existed on the site. So I would definitely go recommend watching that video. Grab a day pass or a week pass if you're not completely sold, but I think you'll love everything we have to offer. Discord's free to join. We have lots of different options in there as well. But thank you, Squirrel Patrol, for coming on. Thank you, Pablo, for taking some time. My name is James McCool, and this has been the